Fighting against a hurricane and terrible waves, the crew of the Trashman are exhausted and injured. Suddenly, the yacht starts taking in water. Now their only option is to dive into the cold, shark-infested sea. Deborah Kiley stood on the deck of a yacht named the Trashman, the salty breeze brushing her face as she stared out at the endless expanse of ocean. She had been hired by the captain, John, for what seemed like a routine job, sailing the yacht from Maine to Florida. An experienced sailor, and the first woman to conquer the brutal Whitbread round-the-world race, Debbie knew sailing well. But as they sailed from Bar Harbor to Portland, she began noticing red flags, neglected tasks, questionable decisions, and a sense that this journey wasn't as straightforward as it seemed. John was far too laid back for a job like this. He cut corners and overlooked crucial tasks that directly affected the ship's seaworthiness. But that wasn't all. John brought along his ex-girlfriend for the trip, a move that directly violated his boss's instructions. Deborah was uneasy, but for now, she kept her concerns to herself. By the time the ship reached Annapolis, it was time to round out the crew. John handed the responsibility off to Deborah, and through her connections, she found Brad Kavanaugh. Brad was no rookie. He'd been sailing since he was a kid and had plenty of experience at sea. He seemed like a solid choice, but Brad wasn't alone. He brought his friend Mark Adams, someone Deborah didn't know. John quickly hired both of them. That's when Deborah's doubts deepened. Something about Mark felt off, and the uneasy atmosphere on board was growing. It got to the point where Deborah picked up the phone and called John's boss. She was ready to quit. However, he convinced her to stay, reminding her of her commitment. The crew of the Trashman set off with high hopes. The weather was calm, spirits were high, and the five of them, John, Deborah, Brad, Mark, and Meg, enjoyed smooth sailing as they left the East Coast behind. They laughed, drank, and settled into a rhythm, taking shifts at the helm. It felt like the perfect start to their voyage. When they reached the Gulf Stream off the coast of North Carolina, everything began to change. The winds picked up, howling louder with each passing hour. The once gentle waves transformed into monstrous 30 to 35-foot walls of water crashing down on the yacht. The winds were screaming at 45 to 55 knots, and every movement required strength and precision just to hold the Trashman steady. Then came Deborah's second watch during the storm. She climbed up to the helm, only to find Mark, drunk. He was barely functional, slurring his words, and incapable of managing the boat. Not only that, Meg, the least experienced of them, was injured after falling below deck when a giant wave hit. After fighting the storm for several hours, Deborah went below deck to rest. And then, the storm roared into something even worse. John woke Deborah for her next shift, his face grim. The winds had climbed to a terrifying 70 knots. The storm wasn't just a gale. It was a full-blown hurricane, and the Trashman was no match. The sails were shredded, flapping uselessly in the wind, and the masts groaned under the strain, threatening to snap. John checked on Meg, her face pale and drawn as she lay crumpled on the floor. Her injuries were bad, and it was clear to him they couldn't wait any longer. She needed a hospital. But as John climbed back up to the helm, the storm's fury reminded him just how impossible that seemed. The Trashman was barely holding together. The anemometer, their only tool to measure the brutal wind speeds, had already been ripped away. The engine was dead, leaving them with no way to safely maneuver into a harbor, even if they could reach one. Desperate, John grabbed the radio and contacted the Coast Guard. He pleaded for a course they could follow to safety. But the storm was unrelenting, the waves now towering above them like liquid mountains. The Coast Guard gave him coordinates, but before long, John realized there was no navigating this. Defeated, he made a second call. He told them they needed rescue. The Coast Guard assured him 2 ships were on the way, but they were still hours out. They sent a plane ahead to locate the Trashman in the raging seas. When the pilot eventually spotted them, John confirmed their position. They were seen. Help was coming. Deborah, utterly spent, dragged herself below deck to rest. She had been on watch for over 8 hours. Exhausted, she allowed herself to close her eyes. Even with the raging hurricane around her, she managed to fall asleep for a bit. Suddenly, Brad shouted. The Trashman lurched violently, thrown off balance by a colossal wave. The hull tilted, and Brad instinctively braced himself as the boat plunged nearly sideways into the sea. Then, the sound. A loud, gut-wrenching crack. He turned to see it. One of the thick windows had shattered under the pressure, and freezing seawater was gushing into the cabin. His heart sank. The boat was going down. Brad scrambled below deck, the icy water sloshing around his legs. He shook Deborah awake, shouting over the chaos. Disoriented and confused, she stumbled to the deck. Meg had woken too, standing paralyzed with fear. John pushed her forward toward safety, his voice rising above the storm as he grabbed the radio one last time. "We're sinking," he told the Coast Guard. As water poured in, the crew sprang into action. Mark ran to the life raft canister, desperately working to free it. Brad went for the Zodiac, the smaller inflatable raft. He managed to release it, but the howling wind caught it like a kite, ripping it away from the boat. Without hesitation, Brad dove into the raging sea, fighting the waves to retrieve it. Meanwhile, Mark was still struggling with the life raft's canister. Deborah and Meg made it out from below deck and into the water. The waves were merciless, dragging Deborah and Meg dangerously close to the wire cables from the sinking yacht. If one wrapped around their legs, it could give them lacerations or, worst case, drag them into the abyss. Deborah knew the risk. Meg, however, didn't. Deborah reached the Zodiac and shouted for Meg to swim with the waves, to let them carry her away from the cables. But Meg couldn't hear her and was panicking. Deborah had no choice. She plunged back into the chaos to help her. The ship was going down fast, and Meg's desperation nearly became Deborah's undoing. As she tried to pull Meg to safety, Meg's frantic grasp nearly dragged her under. Somehow, Deborah managed to free them both from the now deadly rigging. They fought their way to the Zodiac, where Brad and John had already made it. Exhausted and shivering, they clung to the inflatable lifeboat. But then their attention turned to Mark, still standing on the Trashman's stern as it tilted ever closer to the sea. He was their only hope now, frantically working to free the life raft. With a hiss and a pop, the raft exploded from its canister, inflating perfectly. It was everything they needed: supplies, shelter, a beacon to call for rescue. Relief swept over them, until Mark let the life raft go. A sudden gust of wind snatched the raft like it weighed nothing, carrying it into the dark abyss. Their best hope of survival vanished before their eyes. Mark leapt into the water, swimming desperately toward the Zodiac. The Trashman disappeared below the surface, swallowed by the sea. The Zodiac bobbed violently in the crashing waves, barely a refuge against the relentless storm. The crew worked frantically, their hands numb from the cold, pulling Meg into the dinghy first. But when they got her on board, their relief turned to horror. Deep lacerations ran along Meg's legs, jagged and gaping wounds. Before they could fully process the injury, another wave slammed into the Zodiac, flipping it like a toy. They were thrown into the freezing water once again, gasping as the wind howled around them. The wind was cold, biting through their soaked clothes, making it colder inside the dinghy than in the water. They tried flipping the Zodiac upside down, sheltering beneath it. The thin rubber offered little warmth, but at least it shielded them from the biting wind. Yet the chaos didn't stop there. John began panicking, his breaths ragged and shallow. They flipped the dinghy upright again, trying to stabilize him. As the faint light of dawn crept over the horizon, they realized their strength was waning. The cold was unbearable. Their rescue should have been there by now. Where were they? Deborah had stayed in the water, trying to stay calm. Mark jumped in the water as well, but moments later, his voice cut through the crashing waves, sharp and angry. "Deborah, stop kicking me," he shouted. Confused, Deborah shook her head. "I'm not kicking you," she replied. Then it happened again. Mark's face twisted with frustration, and Deborah's heart sank. She ducked her head below the surface, her eyes burning in the stinging salt water. Slowly, shapes emerged in the murky depths. Sharks, circling, too many to count. Her breath caught in her throat. The blood in the water was drawing them in. The predators had arrived. She broke the surface, gasping for air, her voice cracking through the storm. "Sharks!" she shouted. Deborah and Mark scrambled into the Zodiac with a desperate urgency. Hearts racing, they stared in horror as fins broke through the surface of the water, circling the small raft. Predators closing in on their prey. The ocean was alive with menace, the sharks bumping the sides of the dinghy, testing it. Cold, thirsty, and utterly trapped, the crew huddled together exhausted, their hopes shrinking with every passing moment. When the ocean finally calmed, Deborah spotted some seaweed drifting nearby. She had an idea. If they could gather the seaweed and cover themselves with it, maybe, just maybe, it could trap some warmth against their freezing bodies. While Brad kept watch for sharks, the others pulled seaweed into the Zodiac, piling it onto their trembling forms. It wasn't much, but it helped. By the time the third day came, survival was taking its toll. Dehydrated and starving, their bodies were deteriorating. Salt water had infected the cuts each of them had sustained during their frantic escape from the Trashman and of the filth in the Zodiac, only making things worse. Each of them bore signs of staph infections, but Meg was in the worst shape. Her deep leg wounds, caused by the rigging, were festering. The red streaks climbing her legs were now unmistakable. Blood poisoning was setting in. She didn't have much time. Not only that, unbeknownst to them, the sea was carrying their Zodiac further and further away from land. Tensions were unraveling. Deborah and Mark, exhausted and freezing, started snapping at each other. The argument escalated, cutting through the eerie silence of the sea. John tried to intervene, his voice barely steady as he urged them to calm down. "The Coast Guard will come," he said, trying to sound convincing. But Deborah turned to him, her voice low and hollow, and said the words that froze everyone in place. "They're not coming." No one responded. Her words hung in the air like a curse. What none of them knew was that she was right. According to later reports, the Coast Guard had received a false message that the Trashman had made it safely to shore. Because of this, no search had ever been launched. No one was coming for them. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the crew braced themselves for their third night adrift. The cold was unrelenting, the endless rocking of the Zodiac disorienting. All of them were slipping into a state of delirium, their minds unraveling as hunger and dehydration tightened their grip. Deborah and Brad lay in silence, trying to conserve energy, when movement caught their eye. They looked up and saw John and Mark leaning over the side of the raft. For a moment, they thought they might be trying to catch something, but then, to their horror, they realized what they were doing. John and Mark were drinking seawater. Seawater, it feels like salvation in a moment, a cool reprieve from the relentless thirst, but the reality is far more sinister. The salt overwhelms your bloodstream, forcing your kidneys to work overtime, needing more water than your body can afford to give. Instead of hydration, seawater accelerates dehydration, damaging your organs and pushing you toward madness. Deborah and Brad tried to stop them, but it was too late. The damage had already begun. And now, their fragile grip on survival was slipping even further. By the morning of the fourth day, the toll was written on their faces. John stared out into the endless horizon, insisting he could see land. Mark, wide-eyed and mumbling, kept searching for cigarettes he was convinced he'd just bought. Then John snapped. He declared he was going to swim to shore, to get to his car, as if it were parked just beyond the waves. Exhausted, delirious, and powerless to stop him, Deborah and Brad could only watch as John slipped over the side of the raft and into the sea. They begged him to come back, their voices breaking, but he just swam farther. Then it came, a blood-curdling scream that ripped through the silence. And then, nothing. John was gone. But the horror didn't end there. Meg's condition was worsening, the blood poisoning creeping higher up her body, turning her skin a deathly shade. Deborah clung to the Lord's Prayer, whispering it like a mantra as the night closed in. Then Mark, now in the same twisted haze as John, said he was going to the convenience store for beer and cigarettes. Before they could stop him, he slipped over the side of the Zodiac. Deborah called out, pleading, but Mark's response was eerily calm. He said, "Just stretching my legs." Moments later, he was gone too. No scream, just silence. But the silence didn't last. The Zodiac suddenly jolted violently, sending a wave of terror through Deborah and Brad. At first, they thought it was Mark, somehow alive, but then they saw the shadows below. Sharks, dozens of them. The water churned with frenzy as the predators fought over Mark's body. The water around them turned dark. Even after they finished, the sharks continued to circle the raft, bumping and striking it for hours, trying to tip it into the deadly chaos below. Even after they finished, the sharks continued to circle the raft, bumping and striking it for hours, trying to tip it into the deadly chaos below. That night, Brad and Deborah were awakened by Meg. She attacked Brad, clawing and thrashing, her eyes wide and wild. Together, Deborah and Brad managed to push her back, but Meg began chanting in an eerie, otherworldly language, her hands moving in strange patterns. The atmosphere in the Zodiac felt oppressive, almost otherworldly. And then, as suddenly as it started, Meg stopped moving, completely. As dawn broke on the 5th day, Deborah and Brad turned to check on Meg. Her body was lifeless. Meg was gone. And now it was just the two of them, adrift in a raft surrounded by sharks, their strength fading with every passing second. As they prepared to release her onto the sea, Deborah recited Psalm 23. Then, they pushed her body overboard, and not wanting to hear the sharks take her body, they laid back down into the Zodiac and fell asleep. "Debbie," Brad's voice cracked through the oppressive silence. "There's a ship." Deborah shot upright, her body trembling with exhaustion and hope. A ship. Finally, salvation. It was coming straight toward them. But reality hit like a wave. Even if the ship was close enough to crash into them, it might not spot their tiny Zodiac bobbing in the vast ocean. They let the ship pass them, not wanting to waste their remaining strength. But then Deborah noticed something. The ship was turning. Its portside flank came into view, a massive silhouette against the water. The ship was making a U-turn. Adrenaline coursed through their weakened bodies. Despite 5 days without food and almost without water, Deborah and Brad stood, jumping and waving frantically. As the ship approached, they spotted a figure on deck, a man. He threw a line toward them. Their hearts leapt, but it fell too far away, the ship moving too fast for them to reach it. Their chance was slipping away. The ship made another pass, closer this time. Another line sailed through the air, a longer one, with a bright white life ring attached to the end. It landed just a few feet away, tantalizingly close. This was it. If they were going to be saved, they had to swim for it. The ship turned for a third pass, and this time, the lifeline landed just 40 feet from the Zodiac. Deborah didn't hesitate. She plunged into the water. The current was fierce, shoving against her frail body as she fought toward the line. She reached out, missed, but her fingers caught the rope holding the ring, the rough fibers slicing into her hands. She slipped, the rope burning her palms, but she gripped it with her second hand. Success. Relief was short-lived, though. The waves pulled her under, seawater pouring into her nose and mouth. She surfaced briefly, gasping for air, but another wave dragged her down again. And then she hit something, hard, arms wrapped around her, pulling her upward. It was Brad. He had reached the ring and grabbed her, holding on with all the strength he could muster. Together they fought against the waves, but the ocean wasn't done with them yet. They were slammed into the ship's hull, dragged under again by the relentless current. The crew aboard the ship scrambled to reel them in. A gangplank was lowered, and one of the crew, Dogarev, descended to meet them. But every time Brad and Deborah surfaced, the waves pulled them under again. Feared the worst, that the line would snap, or that he wouldn't be able to reach them in time. But then he saw Deborah's arm break the surface. Without hesitation, he lunged forward, grabbing her and pulling both her and Brad onto the gangplank. They were hauled aboard, limp and barely conscious. Crew members surrounded them, including 2 nurses who immediately began tending to their injuries. Brad and Deborah had survived. They were safe. Delivered back to shore, both would make full physical recoveries. But emotionally, the scars of those 5 harrowing days at sea lingered. Both would struggle for years with the trauma, the fear, the helplessness. But in time, they found healing. And astonishingly, both of them would sail again. Thank you so much for watching. If you want to learn more about this, my sources, as well as corrections, if any, will be in the video's description. I'd also love to hear your thoughts in the comments. If you feel I deserve it, you can click the like button or subscribe, and I hope you'll watch my next video as well.